I'm going to try to focus on the abstract that Kitcher provided and kind of expand on that and fill in some blanks and talk about some things from other readings of his or other writings of his. Okay, so the abstract for his lecture next week has, okay, I can break it down like this. We've been warned and action has been too slow on climate change. Okay, distrust of science is an issue. Okay, he says, but even those that don't distrust the science are not doing enough. And so what it looks like he's going to be doing next week is kind of sidestepping or not focusing on trusting the experts, but focusing on those people that believe the science, that trust the science. What are their reasons for not acting on climate change issues? Okay, he says there are two reasons for this. One, that the status quo seems to be safer than making any radical changes or taking any radical action. The idea that the cure might be worse than the disease is an issue that he brings up and he dismisses. And then inequalities, and this is where he brings in the idea of the quadrilemma. Okay, the solution to these two problems, the solutions that he lays out are global venture in deliberative democracy, okay, to fix democracy kind of from the ground up, okay, and to mitigate global capitalism. So that's what he lays out. I've been doing a lot of reading of Kitcher's works over the last month and a half, and probably the most significant or important work is his book Science in a Democratic Society, which he published in 2011. The first part of my talk is going to be stuff mainly from there, and it's going to present his philosophic position or his philosophy, which I think applies to what he's going to be talking about next week. Then there are two of the three readings that were listed on the website. One of them is Can We Sustain Democracy and the Planet Too?, which is a chapter that he wrote for a book that was just published in 2020. And then I read chapter 5, part 2 of the book that was recommended on the website for the discussion, The Seasons Alter. Okay, I just read chapter 5, part 2, not the rest of it, because that's where he talks about the quadrilemma, and that's where I got my information about that. I also listened to some podcasts that were really quite interesting. But let's get to his philosophy. Okay, in Science in a Democratic Society, he starts by talking about basically summarizing an earlier book of his on the ethical project. Okay. And the origins of the ethical project go back to prehistory. Okay, small egalitarian bands of human beings that were trying to overcome altruism failures. Okay, and then they did this by having discussions through which they decided on issues and sort of created different ethical norms and responsibilities. This ethical project evolved, and he says that there became distortions in it. Religion was one of the distortions. We have divine beings giving us the revelation about what we should and shouldn't do. And Kitcher thinks that this is a distortion of the ethical project. It takes it away from its original purpose and intent. He says also that there are no ethical experts. Okay, no one has any more authority than anybody else when it comes to talking about ethics. Everything needs to be decided in an egalitarian discussion. Okay, and then he also says one of the other distortions is that the ethical project has become non-egalitarian. There is a hierarchy in the area of ethics. Okay. He wants to remove these distortions, and he proposes three things. Okay, in science in a democratic society. One, that all members of our species, including those that come after us, our descendants, are to be involved in the ethical project. Second, the discussion that takes place should meet the criteria of what he calls mutual engagement. And I'll talk more about that later. Okay. And the ethical project should work towards giving all people equal opportunity to live what he calls a worthwhile life. So we've got the ethical project trying to get rid of the distortions in it and get it back to its origin, and then also expand it to help deal with our current situation in the world. So we've got who, everyone's included in the ethical project, including our descendants. What, it's done through mutual engagement and ideal discussion. Okay? And then the goal is to provide opportunities for everyone to have a worthwhile life. So extended mirroring, and this is, there are a few more points that I want to make before I get to what I think he's going to be talking about on next week. So to get to this mutual engagement and ideal discussion, which plays such a big part in his philosophy, he talks about extended mirroring. Simple mirroring is when we mediate our desires with another person. We talk to them, we find out what their desires are, and we share our desires with them, and we come to an understanding, and we moderate or mediate our desires so that we can come to a consensus and make decisions. The simple mirroring needs to be extended in both time and in the number of participants. So we have all people and our descendants, so the entire human species and all of our descendants that will come after us, are to become part of this extended mirroring exercise. And this will happen again and again over time. It's something that will continually repeat itself as we discuss issues and try to come to decisions. Move this up a little bit further. Mutual engagement and ideal discourse then come out of this. Okay, we need to approach issues with the willingness to listen and compromise with all others who legitimately engage in the discussion and are willing to compromise as well. And he says legitimately, and this is something I'll come back to a little later, what I think he means by legitimate and illegitimate. Okay, he talks about violations of ideal discourse or ideal discussion when there are illegitimate desires. Moving on to another point here, public knowledge and the division of epistemic labor. Okay, these are two things that again have their origins in prehistory, pre-human history. They are practical things, and they go back to the small bands of human beings, long time ago, right? The division of epistemic labor evolves, and it has four basic divisions: investigation, submission, certification, and transmission. Okay. Since not everyone has the same experiences and can see the same things, investigation gets split up. Certain people are investigating or experiencing certain things, and we don't all have to go and investigate everything that we end up wanting to know. So people experience or see something. In this day and age, we can talk about scientists do an experiment, right? They get a result, they have some information, they submit it to the community, and then the community certifies that somehow, decides whether it's true or false, whether it's reliable, whether it's relevant. And when they certify it, they add it to what he calls the store of public knowledge, okay? And then that information needs to be transmitted. Okay, so this is the division of epistemic labor. Public knowledge, this body of what's considered to be reliable and true information, okay, is collected through these steps in the division of epistemic labor: investigation, submission, certification, okay, and then it's used. The information is used. So when he talks about knowledge and evidence, he's talking about things that are in the area of public knowledge, that have gone through investigation, submission, certification, and are ready to be transmitted or shared, put to use. This system, the division of epistemic labor and public knowledge, were not created for science or for democracy. They evolved over time. There have been different styles or versions of them over time. He talks about the Greek, the Christian, the ancient Greek, the Christian, and early science. Okay, early science is different from contemporary science. He talks about the Royal Society and people like Newton, who were doing their own inquiries and didn't really think that it necessarily had any worth or whatever for the rest of society. Now science has changed, and we think of science as being what should contribute to public knowledge, and it's important to know what's in science. Okay, so public knowledge and the division of epistemic labor can be modified to work better with science and democracy, and he talks about doing that through ideal conversation and mutual engagement. For the most part, he thinks that science works well at finding truth, at finding good, reliable information. But what he talks about is well-ordered science in ways that the scientific endeavor and the scientific community can be modified a little bit to be more effective, okay? And he talks mostly about the allocation of resources, what sorts of experiments, what sorts of information should be sought after, and who decides and how it's decided. He talks about certification, and how certification needs to be more transparent. He believes that certification is being done well in science, but he wants to make sure that the certification is more transparent so that people trust what's in the store of public knowledge that's put there by scientists. And then he thinks that there's a problem with transmission of the information that's part of public knowledge, people having access to it, people being able to understand it. So he talks about using ideal conversation and mutual engagement to come up with this thing, well-ordered science, to shape science to be more relevant, more accurate for our day and age. Okay, I'm going to skip the thing about public reason. Evidential harmony is something that he talks about. So this is the use of public knowledge. Okay. Evidence needs to back up any options that we are deciding from or that we are debating over. Okay. And when you have information being taken out of the store of public knowledge and being matched up with these options that we're trying to decide between or that we're debating between, okay, when you're doing that, then you have evidential harmony. You have a debate that's backed up by proper certified information, knowledge, facts, whatever. Okay. He also talks about oppression, which distorts things. It distorts the collection of knowledge. It distorts how people think certification happens. It distorts it distorts the distribution of public knowledge, and it can distort the framing of discussions and debates. One of the things that he talks about is unidentifiable oppression. When a situation or system is biased or unfair, and we cannot easily determine or identify what or who is behind or responsible for that oppression. Then I'm going to get into now violations of ideal conversation. And again, I'm going through and I'm presenting different pieces of his philosophy that come from the book Science and a Democratic Society, because I think that these will play a part in what he's going to be talking about next week. And I'll try to tie these together and connect them to different parts of his, what I think his lecture is going to be. So one more thing here, violations of ideal conversation. These are things that he says deniers and resistors do. So people that are denying climate change, people that are denying evolution, people that are resisting vaccines, they a lot of times will use these violations of ideal conversation or ideal discussion. One, the ethical practices are not followed. Okay, through the ethical project, we develop these sort of ethical norms and rules, and they should be followed when you're doing this ideal conversation, this ideal discourse, and trying to come to an agreement on what we should do. Okay, if you're not following the contemporary established ethical practices, then you're violating ideal conversation, and the conversation will not go well. Okay. The second one, people advocate for something that will bring results that they don't know, okay, or that will bring results that they really don't want. Ignorance of public knowledge can bring this about, okay, in relation to the action and the outcomes that will come from that action. Public knowledge should have a pretty good idea if we have evidential harmony going on. Public knowledge should have some good explanations or some good expectations set for what the outcomes will be for certain actions. If people are ignorant of this, or if they ignore it, okay, or if they are expecting or thinking about outcomes that go against what they really want, okay, then this would be, again, a violation of ideal conversation. Ignorance of your own true desires. Okay, people want their descendants, he's convinced, people want their descendants to have a better life than they have, or at least as good. And so he says, if people are doing things that public knowledge says will lead to their descendants having a worse life, then they're violating ideal conversation, the rules of ideal conversation. Like I said, there's a connection here with evidential harmony and public knowledge being sort of violated in this. And the third violation, false beliefs or factual errors. Okay, if people believe things that are not part of public knowledge, things that have not been certified as being reliable or true, if they're acting on those beliefs, if their desires are based on those beliefs, then they're violating ideal conversation, ideal discourse. Okay, factual errors, false beliefs. Basically, he's an atheist. He puts pretty much everything that religion has to say about ethics and science, he rules it out, basically. Again, this is another thing. It's connected with evidential harmony and what's in the store of public knowledge. Okay. And the last one of the violations of ideal conversation, not including everyone equally in the discussion and not taking their desires, their reality into account, okay, especially the marginalized. Okay, if you're not taking everyone into account and having them be part of the discussion, then you're violating the principles of ideal conversation. And this is, I believe, really connected with this idea of having a worthwhile life that he has as as basically the goal of the ethical project. Yeah, these four things seem to be the basis for desires that he would call illegitimate. Okay, things that should be kind of ruled out from ideal discourse. They are violations of mutual engagement and disrupt ideal discourse. So this is what we have so far, this big list of ideas from Kitcher's philosophy that I've put out. Let me stop there for a second. Does anybody have any questions? Is there anything? I'm yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I should have asked for a mic before I started asking for questions. Yeah, we would have to give them a voice. Oh, yeah.
What are the ways in engage our generation?
He would say that people alive that are involved in this ideal conversation, this ideal discourse, need to give voice to the unborn, basically. Okay, those people who are to come. And what we need to be thinking about in terms of them and what they would want is, making sure this third point under the ethical project, making sure that we are doing things that give them opportunities to live and create a worthwhile life, and not acting in terms of not, having climate action right now for him is violating ideal discussion, because it's limiting the options for worthwhile lives of our descendants. Is that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Anybody else? Anything else at this point? Any other questions? Okay. Really, as I'm going, feel free, now that we have the microphone out, as we're going, feel free to raise your hand and stop me and ask questions if you want. But hopefully this will become a little bit more of a discussion at some point. Yeah.
I'm not sure this is a question. I just would like to say that thank you for doing this, because it helps one to understand the bigger project Kitcher is involved in. And in a sense, it helps me better understand what I have read from the paper. So thanks for this excursion, and I'm looking forward to the rest.
Okay. So we paused in questions and reflection. Okay. Now I want to get to the abstract and go back to that. Again, the problem is that we've been warned about climate change. Okay. And Kitcher sees no doubt in the science. It has been certified. It is put into public knowledge. Okay. And it should be disseminated, transmitted. People should know about it so that they can make proper decisions based on what's known by climate scientists. Okay. I don't think he'll talk about trusting the experts that much. Okay. What he's going to do, because he says we should trust the experts, it's not necessarily about trust between the public and the people who need to be acting on climate change and the scientists. It's it's about it's about getting the information out. That last stage in the last piece of the division of epistemic labor, right? Transmission, getting people to know it. Okay, what he says is little has been done. Okay, action has been slow and sporadic, even among those that trust the science. And this is where I think he's gonna leave behind the deniers and the resistors and focus on people that trust the science, who are not ignorant, who are not denying what's in public knowledge about climate and climate change. He's going to talk about why those people that trust the science are not acting as they should, not taking steps on climate change, not participating in climate action, not voting for politicians who will do things. Okay. He says there are two causes for this problem. Okay. One is the uncertainty. Okay. He says that the climate science is very clear that the climate is changing and that things will be bad and things need to be done. What's less certain is what exactly will happen when and where. When will we see sea levels rising? When will we see climate catastrophes happen? When will they happen? Where will they happen? How severe will they be? There's a problem, he says, there's an uncertainty in predicting these things. Not that they're not going to happen, they are, but predicting when and how they'll happen is uncertain. And this gives people a sense of, well, we don't know. So why do we do anything at all? Okay. We don't necessarily have to do anything because we don't know what's going to happen. He says that this should not support the status quo, that we should act. And he says that the ideas that people usually talk about, that it will be bad for the economy to do climate action, okay, are not supported, because economic predictions, he says, are even more uncertain and unreliable than the predictions of the climate scientists about what catastrophes will be taking place when and where and whatever. So he basically says that it's not right to say that the cure will be worse than the disease, because no matter how uncertain we are about exactly what's going to happen when, we know that it's going to be bad, and we don't know the economics and the economic predictions as well as we know of the climate predictions. Okay, so he rules that out. The status quo cannot be sustained. Okay. And then he'll go on to talk about inequalities. And this is where the quadrilemma comes in, okay, from the Season's Altar, the book that he wrote with Evelyn Fox Keller. Okay, the quadrilemma is a four-sided dilemma. And there is no solution or answer that can completely satisfy everyone involved in this conflict, in this dilemma. And the participants are future generations, okay, our descendants, the poor in developed countries, or the poor in the wealthy world, okay, the world poor, the poor in the undeveloped world, okay, and general human interests. These are the four things that he says are in conflict with one another in this quadrilemma. And this quadrilemma, the disagreements, the conflicts amongst all of these things are making people say we can't have climate action. Okay? The quadrilemma is causing people who believe the science to not act because they can't find a way to resolve this quadrilemma. Okay. He talks about parts 2 and 3. These people, the poor in the developed or the wealthy world, and the world poor, they don't expect help in dealing with the negative effects of climate policy. We're going to reduce carbon emissions. This is going to hurt the poor in the rich world and in the developing world. These people are going to resist these policies because they think that it will negatively impact them or it will negatively impact other people, and they don't expect to get any help in dealing with the negative impact that it's going to have on them. And then there's the general human interests. This seems to be connected with what he talks about as a worthwhile life. Okay, he talks about all of the great things that human progress and human culture have created and how it may not be equally distributed now, but we need to preserve these things in order to be able to more equally distribute them later on. Okay, so these are the 4 parts. And I talked about that already, right? Okay, so our best hopes to remedy the quadrilemma, okay, is to fix faults in democracy. Also to have a global venture in deliberative democracy, okay, a worldwide conversation about these things, okay, and to mitigate the negative effects of global capitalism. So fix the faults in democracy. And he talks about this in the Can We Sustain the Planet 2 essay chapter. Okay, 2 main ideas that we seem to have about democracy, he says, are superficial and misused. We tend to think of democracy as the will of the people should dictate what the government does. Okay, and that free debate is essential. And everyone can be able to participate, everyone should be able to participate in the debate. Okay, he talks about how these are superficial ideas and they're misused by deniers and resistors, and they're part of oppression in different ways. Okay, what he says is that these are not ends in and of themselves, but they are means to a more important end. What real freedom is not the will of the people or free debate. What real freedom is having more possibilities or opportunities to create a worthwhile life. And if free debate or the will of the people get in the way of that higher or more important freedom, then the will of the people and free debate need to be sort of modified or worked with in order so that democracy doesn't get in the way of this sort of more true freedom that he thinks is more important. Let's see. What he then talks about in the season's altar, okay, is having this global forum. He lays it out, and that goes along with the global venture in deliberative democracy that he mentions in the abstract. And what's going on here is they set out 2 phases of this global forum. Okay, phase 1 is a discussion between climate experts, energy experts, and representatives of developing countries, as well as economists. Okay? And this will be, again, an ideal discussion, mutual engagement that guides this discussion. Okay, and this discussion should arrive at targets for each country for fossil fuel replacements, okay, and development paths for poor nations. So everybody has to reduce fossil fuel use, and in fact eliminate it. He says we need to get to net zero. Okay? Every country should have targets set for it in this discussion. Okay? And special developmental paths should be put together for poor nations so that they are not going to resist climate action, that they're going to get on board with this. Okay. And this could, so that they're not going to be more negatively impacted by climate action than, say, wealthy people or the developed world, okay? And this, he says, might include funding from rich nations to poor nations. It would provide, or things like that. Okay? Also, this discussion should focus honestly, and he says, or Kitcher and Keller say in the Season's Altar, on what makes human lives go well. Okay, and I think this is clearly connected with this idea of worthwhile lives, and not potentially misleading reflections on monetary losses and gains. So I think this is where he's going to come in with mitigating the issues of contemporary global capitalism, to try to get the focus to not be on monetary losses and gains, but to be on what makes human lives go well, what opens up more opportunities for people to live or to create a worthwhile life for themselves. So that's what I expect him to be talking about and how it connects with his philosophy overall.